Okay, hello everyone. My name is David Banks, and along with Nathan Jurgensen, I co-chair Theorizing the Web. Welcome to the first of what we hope are many additions to Theorizing the Web Presents, a series of talks about society and technology. As you probably know, we were supposed to celebrate our 10th anniversary together at the Museum of the Moving Image. And while that won't be happening for the foreseeable future, we're proud of this new project, and we look forward to your feedback and participation. If you would like to talk about this presentation and ask questions, please join us in the Discord, which you can find in the description of this YouTube video and on our website, theorizingtheweb.org. If you like this talk and want to see more, please consider making a donation to both Theorizing the Web and the Museum of the Moving Image. Any bit helps us produce content like this, and we're very grateful that we can do that with you. Briefly, I'd like to thank Barbara Miller, Sonia Epstein, and Tomoko Kawamoto, who have been invaluable in getting this off the ground. And of course, thank you to my fellow committee members. Speaking of committee members, I will now turn it over to Dr. Apryl Williams, who, in addition to being an organizer of Theorizing the Web, is assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Media and the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan, and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. So take it away, Apryl, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Okay, so joining me today will be Dr. Allissa Richardson, an assistant professor at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, an affiliated researcher at the New York University Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies, an incoming fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and the author of Bearing Witness While Black, Smartphones, African Americans, and the New Protest Journalism, published with Oxford University Press, as well as Mutale Nkonde, who is the founding CEO of AI for the People, a nonprofit communications agency. And she started her career as a broadcast journalist and produced documentaries for the BBC, CNN, and ABC. She now also writes widely on race and tech, as well as speaking at conferences across the world. She is currently a fellow at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University, a member of the TikTok US Content Moderation Advisory Council, a key constituent of 3C UN Roundtable for AI, and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Thank you both for joining us.
Hey, how are you?
Thank you, Apryl, for inviting us.
Of course, of course. So, as you both know, we've been all sort of broadly thinking about theorizing this moment of interconnected hypersurveillance of Black folks and Black bodies, from AI tracing and tracking tools associated with COVID, footage from protests being used to surveil Black citizens, and thinking about how journalists are complicit in that process. And I'm really excited to explore all of these intersections with you all. And one of the things that I first came across when I was sort of putting this together is the dictionary definition being so close, or the dictionary definition of observation and surveillance. Goodness. So the way the dictionary defines surveillance is close observation, especially of a suspected spy or criminal. And of course, that's not the only definition, but even that definition is deeply connected with race, right? And so to sort of frame a little bit for people who are watching, I want us collectively to be thinking about how these technologies actively reinstate and reinforce race. So one of the first questions I'm going to ask both of you is if you could sort of talk about broadly how technologies, especially technologies used in surveillance, are implicitly racialized.
I think for me, my kind of history with surveillance technology really came through congressional work. And we had been looking at deep fakes as the lens. Coming from a documentary film background, I was really interested in the way technological systems were capturing our images and then what algorithms did with that. And it was during that work that two constituents came into the office of the congressperson I was working with at the time, I was providing advice to, and start to speak about facial recognition as being introduced as an alternative to keys. And the way that it was being really messaged to them was this was going to be a freedom. You would no longer have to look for your keys in your bag. You could go to the door and it would open. But what they were really concerned about at the time was how cameras in their garbage chutes were being used to basically spy on them. Every time they didn't separate out garbage, there had been an old city ordinance here in New York that you would be charged $25. And where this took place was an area called Brownsville, a neighborhood in Brooklyn, where the median annual income is around $20,000 a year, compared to almost $70,000 in the rest of the city. So these $25 were extremely hard for the residents to come by. And that kind of encapsulates your entry point, because the way that facial recognition as a technology was sold was this idea of observation, but the way cameras were actually being used in their homes was a criminalization. There were fines associated to them. And so really that was the beginning, that was a real entry point for me to learn about how surveillance technologies actually worked when the subject were Black. Because this particular management company had within New York City 6 other residents that were in whiter, richer neighborhoods. And when they came to the tenant meeting, the language that was used was, this was the community in which these would be tested. This was a community in which these would be tried out. And at that point, some critical questions for me around who gets tested on when we're thinking about technologies, and why are the people that these technologies being tested on racialized as Black? And I can certainly speak more to the merits of that particular technology, but that prompt really made me think about how punitive that particular type of technology being used in the marketplace, at least here in New York.
I really love that. I love this conversation about cameras too, because central to my work is what African Americans do when a camera is placed in their hands, right? And 2 really big, I guess, grounding theories really guide the questions that I ask in all of my work. And that's this push and pull between surveillance and surveillance. And so when I think about the incredible work of Simone Brown, for example, in her groundbreaking book, Dark Matters, she talks about how this long arc of surveillance against Black people really begins in slavery. And she talks about the lantern laws, and she talks about all of the codes that were really designed to control the mobility of Black people. So then when I play with that word again, mobile, and I think about mobile journalism, mobile devices, in many ways, the mobile device has allowed African Americans to challenge that mobility and to challenge that control that many people tried to have on their gaze. And so in my book, Bearing Witness While Black, I talk a lot about how this new counter narrative is really driven by a desire to provide surveillance. And that's looking from below. And that's also coined by Steve Mann. And it's an incredible concept when you think about someone looking at you from on high, in this case, police who use body cams, blue light cameras on corners, dash cams, helicopters, CCTV. There's no limit to how many different ways they can surveil. But when you think about surveillance and the tools that are able to be, I guess, afforded to us or used by us, the smartphone has been essential in creating many of the narratives that we see now in mainstream media. So as a former journalist, I became really intrigued with how are Black citizen journalists really pushing their narratives forward by gazing from below, and how does that gazing from below really act as something new in terms of a movement that is not easily controlled now, What we're starting to see, however, is that mobility is once again being challenged. So now that geotagging and other technologies are in place that can very easily pinpoint where someone's streaming from, for example, it becomes a new game in terms of just as African Americans were leveraging surveillance to overcome the constraints of mobility that they had, they now have a new lens or new tools at their disposal in terms of the state-sponsored side to make sure that those narratives don't get out. And so there's this constant push and pull between surveillance and surveillance and these old narratives of where and when can Black people enter that I'm really fascinated by.
Yeah, Allissa, that's great. That's a great segue into sort of the next direction that we're going to head in, which is really thinking about how surveillance has been used in this current moment. So we have these two huge cultural phenomena. We have COVID, which is a pandemic, so it's affecting everyone all over the world. And then we also have the Black Lives Matter movement, which does also impact people all over the world. But it's particularly centered in the United States for the time being, at least. And so I've been thinking a lot about how these two things interacted to create this technoscape that Black people now have to navigate, right? It creates this sort of extended arena in which Blackness is almost hyper surveilled, right? Like we're seeing people in protests, and it's making people more aware of Blackness, right? And the demands of Black Lives Matter. We're hearing people talking about defunding the police, which we're going to touch on a little bit too. And so people are really starting to have these conversations more visibly, but which is a good thing. But along with that, we also have COVID and this desire for people to track and trace. And so we're seeing the discourse sort of shift around that, the tracking and the tracing. And so one of the things I've really been thinking about is whose safety is being prioritized when we're thinking about tracking, especially for COVID and of the protests, right? Like whose safety is being prioritized, who will be made more safe by the tracking and the surveillance, and who is more harmed. So I'm interested to hear what you both have to say about that.
Yeah, one of the things that I found really fascinating in researching this book is that there were so many grassroots activists, organizations here in Los Angeles that were able to map the movement or the mobility again of police. And they showed me over and over again many maps that said, in this particular area, this is where the police tend to congregate the most. And try to guess what part of town this is. And as someone who's only lived here for about 3 years, it's pretty difficult when you shrink a map to see what exact neighborhood that is. And so, for example, I would say, well, I think that is Beverly Hills or so. And they would say, you're not, exactly wrong, but the police don't hang out in a wealthy area. They hang out really on the fringes of that wealthy area because they want to make sure that no one is coming in and no one is leaving out who's not supposed to. And so that was really striking to me because I assumed all the police activity would be, for example, in Skid Row. And I would say, well, I think the police will be here. I think they will be concentrated in this particular area the most. And time again, they would say, nope, it's around the fringes of these wealthier areas of Los Angeles that kind of create this border or phalanx to make sure that nobody penetrates it. And so when we think about who is going to be made most safe, I think about those maps that they showed me, the startling data visualization that showed you can actually map someone's behavior just by tapping into where their phone has been. We can see where they work, we can see if they've gone to the gym that day, we can see if they have kids and they pick up from school at a certain time. And so even when you try to anonymize this data, the patterns and the repetition of where we are flowing will definitely endanger people of color and create a heightened sense of surveillance. In terms of the protests, I've had many activists who I interviewed in the book say that police spoke to them not by their formal given name when they saw them getting ready to ramp up for protests. They called them by their Twitter handle. And so they were saying, wow, there are entire parts of police departments that are devoted to getting to know our online profile and perhaps looking at these anonymized patterns to see where we're going and what we're saying. Another layer that I'll add on before I kick it over is that the Stingray technology is incredibly disturbing as well. There's been all kinds of reports, too many to even fit into this book. It would take another book to fill, in terms of police forces who have been investing in the technology that will listen in on cell phone conversations and text messaging. And so we've had many reports, especially out of Chicago. That was the first, I guess, leaked report, if you will, that showed that Black Lives Matter activists who were out there trying to protest during Black Friday in November many years ago reported that their phones were scrambled. And when they saw these unmarked cars and huge white vans going by, they were wondering what was happening. And of course, they did not feel safe. They didn't feel protected, right? Because even though they didn't see a police presence, they sensed it. And then later on, we have the leaked audio footage that I mentioned in the book of the police officers who were saying, I think I see fill in the blank. And they started talking about the activists by their Twitter handles. And so again, when we think about this trace technology and this mobile, this use of the mobile to trace people in the name of controlling a disease, it just harkens back to me to those data visualizations where we have these borders around the wealthier neighborhoods, at least here in LA, that control who goes in, who goes out, and that eye, that gaze is always there. So it's a panopticism that's frightening.
Absolutely.
I think from my perspective, one of the things that I worked on this year when I was at Berkman Klein up at Harvard was this idea of automated anti-blackness and how understandings of the criminalization of Black bodies and violence, state violence against Black bodies, those meanings are now being encoded into systems that are designed to keep us safe, to keep us well. And under that frame, I've been thinking a lot recently, certainly after we all had to leave campus because we had to go back to our respective places, how COVID tracking technologies is potentially part of that idea of technologies that would fit into this idea of automating anti-Blackness. And the reason I say that is I remember months ago, it feels like I tweet so much in COVID that every day is a month, but months ago, tweeting that I had looked into my phone's privacy settings because I am one of these crazy people that looks at my privacy settings almost every day. Because of the type of work that I do. And within the privacy settings of my phone were this tracking enabled device. I have an iPhone 10, I think. And within the iOS, an update had been pushed and suddenly this capability was there. And as I went to my colleagues at Berkman, half freaking out, half asking a question, as I often do in that community, I was told that it hadn't been enabled. And that made me extremely scared because COVID in itself is a disease, but the disease has social meaning. And one of the things that we had found out prior were African-American people and Latinx people were those most impacted by the disease. And therefore, in the tracking of this disease for public health purposes, we were then going to be over-indexing Black and brown bodies and then labeling them as diseased. If you actually did follow through with, once you've used the technology, you have a positive test and you upload to the cloud, that data set is going to be skewed by people who are poor, people who don't have access to healthcare, people who are otherwise structurally enabled, and then labeling them as disease, which really harkens back to ideas of eugenics that we saw at the dawn of medicine, which was the experimentation of enslaved women's bodies. And I'm forgetting the author, and I hate to forget authors, but Medical Racism was a really, really famous text that's really informed this idea that because we were declared as 3/5 of people within the Constitution, then from a medical perspective, our bodies were not human and therefore more subject to harm. And the reason that really concerns me is that I saw so little in the popular press about Google's entree into the medical system. If you look at their AI spending budget, and if you go into those pages, what they're trying to do is create things like automated charts, which require this medical data. So when you go into a hospital, it can predict what you're coming in for, and then therefore the type of treatment, and how within that data set, there would be this confluence between Blackness and disease. And because we don't have overriding privacy legislation, what is there to say that the insurance companies could then justify higher rates to insure Black bodies based on some of these tracking technologies? And that's something that I've written about extensively in terms of automated anti-Blackness, because it's this idea that it's a COVID tracking technology, which we need in a pandemic. It's of a public service, but that data set is being collected by two private companies who within their mandate are not supposed to pursue the public good. They are supposed to pursue shareholder value. And the fact that we're uploading or supposed to upload our medical information means that we are then foregoing any chance to have HIPAA laws or any other protections over medical information because we've given it up freely. So when you think about the question of who does this protect, I don't know that I can answer that directly, but I can say that it does not protect the lives of Black people based on the way that Black medical information has been used. And now we're using telephone geolocation technologies to really, in this idea that I'm playing with, to really automate our anti-Blackness in the field of health. And then the final thing I'll say, because I don't want to take up all the time on ranting about COVID tracking technologies and why I think that Black people should be particularly cautious of this, is I had to leave my house. I don't leave my house often because I'm scared of sexism, racism, and medical malpractice. So I pretty much stay here until we have a cure. But I left my house and then my phone went off and told me that somebody was more than 8 feet. There was someone within of my 8 feet radius. I, like many Black people, live in a redlined neighborhood. So that person was Black, and therein that reinforcing of the awareness of people in physical space. And it really, it terrified me. We have the right to privacy in public space, and under the guise of public health, I feel like that's being very much threatened.
Yeah, and I want to sort of think about this idea that I've heard in popular culture recently, and maybe you all have as well, that once people realized who COVID was impacting, the government just stopped caring. And I think that that's really interesting because I don't want to believe that that's true. But certainly if we're thinking about the way these technologies have historically operated to protect whiteness and white people rather than Black and brown bodies, that certainly seems to lend itself to that narrative, right? And there's been a historical distrust of systems that protect everyone because typically they don't protect everyone. And in fact, as you were saying, Mutale, these health systems actually are detrimental to Black people and have been in the past. And so I want us to sort of think about and move in the general direction of thinking about this distrust and how this distrust in the system ultimately plays out and sort of reifies and reinstantiates this surveillance in a way. What do you think about that?
I think that's a perfect assessment. I think there is a warranted distrust. And as someone who has a background in biology, I started out as a biologist working in FDA and really kind of studying antimicrobial resistance and studying how do these medicines that we're trying to give ourselves become ineffective in the face of misuse, abuse, and things like that. I realized in my time in the lab that there is an inherent distrust of science end of medicine, but not for the reasons that many people think in the African-American community. It's not that we don't believe that science is effective and should be listened to. It's the fact that there are cases like the Tuskegee experiment, where the government willfully tried to see how long African-Americans could survive with syphilis and what would the effects of that long-term exposure be, how far gone would the disease eat at them, and what would these observations, as we're talking about, how would they help other people who got this, who were not Black, survive the disease. That's a very famous case that many African Americans can rattle off very quickly when they begin to think about their relationship with the standard medical institution, if you will. The other one that maybe is not so known or spoken about is Henrietta Lacks's case. I'm a native Marylander, and as someone who grew up in the state of where Johns Hopkins is king, the institution is incredibly guilty in terms of using a Black woman's cells to further research for many, many decades without giving her family any kind of compensation for it. More recently, I've seen the story being brought to the big screen, or the small screen, I should say, an HBO special that Oprah Winfrey brought to the screen, which was incredible. But before that, there was the book, right? There was the incredible reporting on that medical apartheid, as it was called. And so when we think about just those cases alone of Henrietta Lacks's cells being used to further cancer research and all other kinds of scientific advancements that have gone on throughout our history, as well as the Tuskegee experiment, for which those families never received any kind of compensation. It's very easy to see how many African Americans would not want to go to the doctor during a pandemic, because we need only look at, again, I'm a journalist and a journalism professor. You look at the news reports, and the news reports are saying that people who did try to go to the hospital were misdiagnosed, if you will, and told that they either had pneumonia or a cold and told to go ahead and quarantine at home, and then they died at home. And this most commonly happened in Detroit. There were many heartbreaking stories that came out of Detroit that talked about that legacy of mistrust, and how when we finally try to overcome it and try to trust that system, it still fails us. So when you think about that already going on, and that medical distrust, and then you compound that with the distrust that many African Americans have of the media itself. I mean, we need not only look past this Kerner Commission report that happened many, many years ago to know that African Americans consistently do not see themselves featured favorably in the news. And recently I wrote an essay for the conversation about how we need to stop showing these images of Black death over and over and over again, and looping them with the casual air of a sports highlight when no other race has to see themselves die like that. And I equated it to the beheading, the death of Daniel Pearl, that's been scrubbed from the internet, the many, many incredibly heinous and horrible pictures of the victims of 9/11 who had to make a tough decision to jump from the building or stay inside and die. Those pictures have been scrubbed from the internet. All of the screaming pictures and videos of folks who are running for their lives during mass shootings are scrubbed from the internet, and rightfully so. Yet I can, as a journalist, go into any of the big name stock photograph organizations without saying any names, and I'll pull them up and I can type in Trayvon Martin. And instead of seeing a picture of him alive, I see his post-mortem picture as one of the very first ones there. So when you talk about distrust and you talk about having to see this symbolic annihilation of yourself over and over and over again in the media, and then a very real annihilation when we think about COVID and we think about the lackluster response that there's been to keep Black people thriving and alive, or even the victim blaming in terms of our very own Surgeon General saying, do it for Big Mama, stop drinking, or a sitting senator saying Black people just don't wash their hands. And that's parroted in the media. Again, that fusion of distrust for health and the distrust for journalism create such a tipping point that makes it very easy to understand why people are risking their lives and going out to protest, because enough just became enough.
Okay, so I have to follow that. Amen to everything, Dr. Richardson. It's so amazing to be in conversation with you. But I would also like to kind of advance this conversation by pointing out that many of the technologies that are currently being used and marketed as AI don't work. So when I think about that in particular, I have very recently been writing about the Compass algorithm. And for folks that don't know, ProPublica did an amazing investigative piece in 2016 where they were looking at 7,000 decisions made by the Compass algorithm, which was a tool being used in Broward, Florida to decide basically who was going to reoffend and who wasn't. And so it was used as a bail predictive instrument. And 2 years prior to this article being written, then then Attorney General Eric Holder had had a meeting where he had spoken about how risk assessments within criminal justice were going to increase racial bias. He felt that given the fact that crime data was already encoded with racial bias, by automating that, again, using that automated anti-blackness frame, you were going to get more of the same results. And he was ignored. So when we think about questions of trust, we've also got to think about the disrespect and disregard for Black expertise, where we're very often the first people to point to this. And because it comes from a Black mouth, and because these are expertise that are held and developed by Black people, white power structures, those that decide who produces knowledge and who ingests knowledge, disregard it. And in this particular case, ProPublica, I myself are a journalist myself, it's so beautiful in the article. They say, well, if this investigation is going to be done by the government, we're going to do it. So they analyze the results of 7,000 decisions made in this particular jurisdiction, and they find out that Black defendants are 77% more likely to be given long bail sentences than their white counterparts with similar crimes. And to kind of put that in the frame of those of us that love popular culture, that's why there was the Free Meek Mill campaign, because he had been given a 12-year bail sentence for really quite a small crime, but obviously people can grow and change in 12 years. And in his case, he got famous, met Nicki Minaj, and went to the BET Awards where he was arrested, again. So you can see this huge change in his life. But one of the things that people rarely say about that particular algorithm was that it was only correct 20% of the time. So of those predictions that were made, this magic of AI, it has an 80% failure rate. So this distrust is really also a recognition, and it's Black brilliance pointing out that these technologies are pre-market. They are being experimented, going back to use that same analogy that I did in terms of health, on Black populations. And we don't have the structural power, and we certainly don't have the rules in place to say that we cannot have untested technologies in the marketplace. So when I was in Congress, one of the first things that we did was mass education for Congress people, along with my then colleagues at Data and Society Research Institute here in New York, where we taught to them about what an algorithm was, how it worked, and the implications that it had on Black communities, because my target were the Congressional Black Caucus. And I had to find a way of creating a narrative that would make technology real for them. And criminal justice was an area that they have always been engaged in. And I would argue that all Black freedom fighters have been engaged in. So I'm really looking forward to defund the police, but that's a different question.
Yeah, we're actually going there next.
Oh, we are good. But one of the things that we found with this idea of algorithms was this trust that the math was correct. Mm-hmm. When in actual times, there's so many different types of technologies where they don't work, and they specifically do not work for Black people. But because we are the canaries in the coal mine, they're marketed, they're used. And then in the cases of people that want bail, Meek Mill being one, but he represents so many people who are given these wrong determinations, it changes their lives in ways that are only harmful. And that is only happening because they're Black. And that is a way to deploy white supremacy through these neutral processes, algorithmic decisions.
Right, absolutely. So as you segued us so beautifully, distrust is really central to the idea of defunding the police. Within that cry, that rally to defund the police, is the idea that Black people cannot trust systems that were created for white people or by white people to maintain whiteness and white supremacy. And so the question that I want to ask both of you is AI tech compatible with defunding the police? Is it possible to use these technologies in a quote responsible way if we're going to defund the police? And in other words, does defunding the police also mean regulating AI technologies?
I think, oh, go ahead. What did you say, Dr. Williams?
I was just going to say, it's a lot. I think I packed a lot into that one question, but feel free to pick it apart and do whatever you need to do with it.
I think I want to back it up just a little bit in terms of when we say defund the police, what do we mean? And I think that for people who do support that movement, it means defund it in the way that public education has been defunded systematically many, many years. We've had all of these incredibly astute Black scholars like Eve Ewing show us how school closings can, in specifically Black neighborhoods, shape and change that school to prison pipeline. So when we think about defunding them, schools have been defunded for decades. There are many, many public school districts in our nation right now that have the bare minimum in terms of supplies, let alone think of trying to reopen those things during a pandemic. It becomes quite, I didn't even know the word to use, but it just seems hateful to open up schools in some of these very, very marginalized communities that had the bare minimum to begin with. So when we think about defunding the police and we kind of gasp, we should also think about how education has been defunded for so long. And so when we think about where the money may then flow, if we take money from the police and put it back into education, put it back into mental health services, and put it back into some of the other pathways, such as substance abuse counseling and things like that, that used to be funded with public dollars, then it becomes less of an argument in terms of, oh, well, we just not have a police force at all. It's not at all what people are asking for who believe in that particular movement. They're asking for that money to be redistributed to children so that that school to prison pipeline can be broken up, and so that more care can be given to the most vulnerable in our society who are most likely to come in contact with police first. I think that one of the things that also I hear when I think about defund the police is how so many of these cases that I wrote about in the book are started by these smaller or these petty crimes that we're thinking about. And most of the time, they're these petty crimes of people who are trying to actually be entrepreneurial and people who are trying to make a way for their families. So if we think about, for example, the case of Eric Garner, and this is one I really harp on in the book, it infuriates me to think about a man who lost his life because he was selling loose cigarettes in what is an entrepreneurial endeavor, and that many people would criticize and say, well, you're not supposed to be doing. But if you have many kids, and again, smaller, different structures in place where you live in terms of gaining employment and keeping employment that would make it so that that's not an option for you, that is when this whole discussion of defunding becomes essential, because in that particular case, he lost his life for selling cigarettes, but then the person who took it was given a raise, right? And so even though Officer Pantaleo was the person who was taken off the streets and put at a desk job, it has been widely reported, and I touch on in the book, how he received a raise that put him well into the six figures, right? And so when we think about that, and we think about his daughter, Erica Garner, dying, trying to get him justice, having a heart attack well before her time, before she even turned 30 as a new mom. And we think about his baby girl, Emerald, then having to pick up that baton and say, someone needs to be arrested. And the life that's lost in terms of all the years that you're spending trying to get justice while someone else is enjoying a raise, the defund the police rallying cry makes much more sense, because you're thinking of people like Alton Sterling, who are selling CDs and DVDs trying to make a living. We're thinking of people like George Floyd, who in the middle of a pandemic is trying to, quote unquote, float a $20 bill because he wanted to get something from the store. And he moved to Minneapolis to find work. It's not like he was not working, but something in our system is not working when we say that we have all of these men, women also, who are trying to find work and trying to provide for their families, but are getting poorer and poorer, and trying to find other ways to support them that bring them in direct contact with the police, who in many cases are making more money than anyone in the community. It becomes quite troubling. And then some will argue that police are paid very, very small amounts in smaller cities. They may say, well, not every cop makes six figures, and that's very true. But one of the things that I also found in researching the book is that many police forces have been able to militarize themselves to the degree that we see because they're seeking grant funding. And in many cases, specifically, I'll talk about the Chicago Police Department, they were able to purchase all of that Stingray equipment that I mentioned earlier through a grant. $134,000 or so grant was able to equip the force with these listening devices, right? And so when you apply for federal dollars to get these kinds of things, and you have at the very top of this administration an attorney general that said, we're going to roll back any type of consent decrees against police departments, and you guys kind of do what you want to do, it becomes a very dangerous place and environment for many people who are more likely to encounter. So when we say defund the police, think about where those dollars would be best redirected to help people get jobs that will be able to provide for their families, to get their kids educated in places that aren't designed to incarcerate them as soon as they graduate or sooner. And those are the kind of things that are all tied into this Black witnessing, because Black people, again, have been the ones blowing the whistle on all of this and picking it apart to such a degree that they show race as a central factor in all of this technology and the decision-making that stems from it.
So I think kind of picking up on there, thank you, Dr. Richardson, that was brilliant. I think picking up from there, kind of attacking this question of regulation that you pose. One of the things that has been really interesting to me in terms of defund the police was the response of the Congressional Black Caucus. And that's really the federal body that I've been really focused on over the last few years. And one of the things that I found that while I was doing that work, we entered the biometric barriers bill. And within that defund the police moment, we were actually in a position to offer language that had already been drafted that could then go into the larger Justice and Policing Act of 2020 that was entered to the House last month. And in it, we argued that the use of facial recognition, because of the fact that it has this inaccuracy issue that I referred to in my last response, if you have dark skin, so we're not even speaking about Black skin at this point. If you have dark skin, the gender shade study that came out of MIT by Joy Bulawami and Timnit Gebr will tell us very clearly that it is going to misidentify you 40% of the time. And the way that these facial recognition body cams were even brought into police forces are through these grants that Dr. Richardson just referred to, but specifically grants that were expanded under the Obama administration in response to the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, after Mike Brown. So one of the things that people speak about in the history of Black Lives Matter as a movement, they often really jump over those policing, I call them powwows. I'm sure that there is another way, or I shouldn't call them powwows, actually, as I think about it, that's insensitive, but I call them meetings of Black Lives Matter protesters, police, the Obama administration, and the Attorney General's office. And their response at that time was, let's reform the police. Let's reform the police. And within those reforms, we still went on to see the deaths of Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, because women's deaths are not raised in this. And I want to make sure that in this particular conversation that we do that, specifically as Black women. I'm thinking of Castillo, the one that was live streamed over Facebook, these deaths continued because in that particular instance, reforming the police didn't get to the fact that they could still buy this AI technology that was designed to surveil Black bodies. And the logics and the culture of policing are really do harken back to this idea of when bodies were enslaved and we would have white people literally overseeing people do their work in the fields. Like what these people were looking for and what they were overseeing is still a complete mystery to me. And Hollywood has not really provided me with any credible answers, given that they had already been taken from Africa, had no idea who they were in a foreign land and didn't even know the other people on the plantation. And despite that, we resisted, ran, and continue to advocate for our freedom to this day. So shout out to Black people. But beyond that, the fact that policing has become enabled, right? The ability to cause harm to Black people under the guise of policing has been reinformed by AI systems like ShotSpotter, which is a listening technology, as Dr. Richardson has been referring to. And here in New York, ShotSpotter is a technology where when the algorithm thinks it's heard a gunshot, can then record ambient sound and the conversations of people around. But that could be warrantless search. Like, what are you looking for, bro? Like, people are really just saying hi to each other, shut it off. But that's in Black neighborhoods. We're not finding it in rich white neighborhoods where privacy is a right that's afforded because of money and what I would call American caste, as I've seen in the writing. So my argument and the position taken by the Congressional Black Caucus was we cannot have a conversation about modern policing unless we have a conversation about AI regulation. The technology as it stands does not work. If the images can be used to incriminate the wrong people. We have just seen that case in Detroit where a man was arrested in front of his family for being in a store where he stole $3,700 worth of luxury watches. It turns out that he hadn't been in that store since 2014, a fact that was verified using geolocation data of his phone. So they obviously had that technology. And in the case of his interrogation, the idea that pictures of Black people look like Black people is a fallacy, because when he held the image up to his face, it became very clear that they had just assumed all Black people look alike because the person did not resemble the person that was now in custody. And it was just that a police officer in that particular incident said, well, the computer got it wrong, is the only reason the ACLU have a case against facial recognition. And that's the first one that we know about. So when we say regulate, it's not just the technology is wrong. Human technology, looking at Black people, distinguishing one from the other, and then using that to criminalize isn't there yet. The technology of our human eyes. And in his particular case, because he's gone through booking, his biometric data is now within the Detroit police system. Because how is he going to get his fingerprints back? How is he going to get his photo back? And through systems like AI, Clearview AI, companies like that, they could then use that. Data brokers could then use those images in the data set. And the last thing that I'll say about regulation of technology in terms of defund the police is we have seen announcements by IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft to get out of those markets. But the truth of it is they were only speaking about policing, community policing. They weren't speaking about ICE. They weren't speaking about border control. They weren't speaking about these other agencies. They were small players. The biggest players in facial recognition and policing are actually companies that we don't know. So this was a tiny piece of the market. And we don't have the politics on the Senate side, nor at the executive branch to, certainly our executive branch, I don't have the confidence. Wait, I'm trying to be polite. I just don't think they'll understand. I think they have other things to think about. And they're not thinking about those things well. And this is complicated. So we would need to vote people that could at least hire people that understood, but we also are in political disarray. So my argument would be that defunding the police, to follow on from Dr. Richardson, first of all, has to be understood to be a public good, which I certainly believe that it is. The existing systems that we have of education and social services would also have to be radically reimagined, because they often behave in punitive ways towards Black people and work in partnership with the police. So as much as I think more mental health services, also this idea of restorative justice being invested in and finding more community-based responses. And then on top of that, looking at these technologies and deciding whether we even want to use them. I'm a huge advocate to say that facial recognition, given the harm that it can cause to the lives of people, particularly those racialized as Black and other negatively racialized people, is so grave that we shouldn't be using them on human subjects. And we really should be thinking about conservation and using biometrics. I often say in interviews, we should use biometrics in the ocean to make sure that we have enough whales. We should use them in wherever zebras live to make sure that their stripes are fine. Like, let's use these in ways that are life affirming, but are not going to impinge on the human and civil rights of human subjects.
Yeah, and you both of you, Dr. Richardson and Ms. Nkonde, have done such an amazing job of highlighting the interconnectedness of the surveillance and really positioning it as something that is everyday and continuous for Black people. And that's something that I really wanted to make sure that we talked about, and you both have, so thank you so much for that. And we have just a few minutes left, unfortunately, and we're gonna turn a little bit and take some questions from the audience. Who's watching, and I'm going to have to put you both on a 1 minute time response for these questions, because we have 3 and I want to try to get them all in. So the first is from Joseph, and he asks, or they ask, Dr. Richardson's mention of the Tuskegee experiment just reminded me of a trend I've noticed of anti-vaxxers and other conspiracy groups that are using that as a means of denying mask wearing and future vaccines. Anyone else seeing this trend, and is there something to be glimpsed through the lens of surveillance and surveillance, or even the appropriation of Black trauma as a means of furthering other causes?
That's a great question, Joseph. And I teamed up recently with Dr. Maya Williams-Fain, and we're going to be writing a paper about the Black right, if you will, the far right. And we're talking specifically about these different forces that are at play in terms of where people get their knowledge, right? And I don't think that we should be looking at news as a monolith when we talk about Black news. There is a Black right and a Black left, and on the Black right, we have started to see, Dr. Fain and I, evidence of people who are denying that COVID existed, and that there are 2 very high-profile activists and YouTubers who were fired from their posts with Fox News because they were denying that this was a disease at all. They called it an outright hoax. They said that it was just designed to threaten the current president's bid for presidency again, his bid for re-election. And to stick within that 1 minute time frame, there's absolutely these different spheres, public spheres of information that different groups are tapping into to justify whether or not they feel their rights are being impeded. But we should be very careful, and we should especially be careful when we use these tropes of slavery and of imprisonment or solitary confinement to define what we're experiencing in terms of sheltering in place. So I've seen, for example, the usage of the Black slave, a Black woman slave whose mouth is muzzled by white protesters just before the George Floyd uprisings, who were saying, we just want to go out and get haircuts, but we feel like we're being enslaved. And they were using her image to describe what they felt. They were using the language of solitary confinement to talk about how they felt in their own home, sheltering in place. I'm sure Khalif Browder would disagree with what
Absolutely.
they felt, you know? So when I hear things like that, I'm immediately triggered, because I think that we are getting too free in many instances with trying to fit or shoehorn our personal beliefs with faulty evidence or false narratives. And as a journalist, that does bother me, Joseph, it does.
I can actually reply to that, and I'll do it really quickly. I'm working on a misinformation project right now, disinformation, I should say, project right now. And one of the things that we've already seen in our Twitter data set is the marriage of myths around COVID. So we are specifically seeing things like Black people can't get COVID. COVID was invented by the CIA. And then at the end of that communication is, and this is why we shouldn't vote. So I would definitely, it would take me more than a minute to explain that. And I'm an over talker, but I would say yes.
Awesome. And so the next question is, given the history of racism in medicine and medical research, Black people are right to be distrustful of the medical establishment. At the same time, there are concerns that the COVID vaccine development overwhelmingly involves white subjects. The recent Moderna trial had 89% white subjects. So how do we make sure that the COVID vaccine is designed and deployed in a way that benefits Black people? How can vaccine developers do so while being aware of the history of racism in medical research?
Wow.
A loaded question. A good one, but a big one.
So I'm not going to give a satisfactory response, certainly not in a minute, but one of the things that I would posit back to the questioner is, how can we imagine a system, how can we imagine a society where Black lives actually matter? And within that society, Black lives mattering so much that we're not harmed by those that we look to protect us. And so I think that in order to have that type of research go on and for it to be credible and for it to be trusted, we have to think about reparations, and we have to think about ways of, first of all, acknowledging the harm, because certainly with Henrietta Lacks, the thing that always got me about that story where John Hopkins were just being John Hopkins. They were being the best in the world. They were raising money. They were employing everybody. So Black people had this really, I have this with many institutions where when I try to describe it to other people, I'm like, it's like a bad boyfriend. It's like, you think you need him, but he kind of hits you, but then he's kind of okay, but then you think of need him and you think you're abusive. And that was certainly the relationship that John Hopkins had with folks in Baltimore, but eventually they had to come around and do that restorative work. And within that restorative work, you get trust. So I'd say that the medical establishment would definitely have to do that. How, I can't tell you in a minute. And then in terms of the Moderna trial, that's such an interesting question, because while I'm basically living in my house until we have a vaccine, I'm absolutely refusing to be in any trials, or anybody I know to be in any trials. And I want to make sure that the battery tests on white populations are well established before I would even have the trust to do that. And I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I grew up in Zambia. I was born in Zambia. I don't have polio because I was vaccinated by my parents, vaccinated both my children. And yeah, it's complicated. Sorry, I didn't answer the question.
And so did you want to respond to that, Dr. Richardson?
I just want to piggyback on one thing that Mutale said earlier, is that Black brilliance is present and it needs to be trusted. And in many of these cases, when African Americans face another African American in a medical setting, there is a sense of a sigh of relief, and still you're on your guard a bit, because just because you're Black, it doesn't mean that I should automatically trust everything, but I am a little bit, my guard is down a bit more. And when I think of cases, again, in the journalism, I see citizen journalists who recorded a Miami doctor who was arrested in front of it, well, attempted to be arrested in front of his own house. He was handcuffed, and his wife had to come outside and show to the police officer his ID. And then the cop still asked him, well, what are you doing with this van? And he said, I'm treating homeless people who are living in Miami to make sure that they don't get COVID. And I was just unloading my van and, doing what I need to do at the end of the day. And I think of Black doctors like that who are in the thick of this and trying to be first responders, trying to be the pillars in their community that we need them to be right now. And they are still criminalized. There's still that Black skin behind a white mask, right? And so if we think about that play on Frantz Fanon, it becomes incredibly scary to be in the medical field as a caregiver at this time, when you know that you could be criminalized as well. So I think that when we think about these trials, we must include Black doctors, not only in the development of these drugs, but in the administration of them and in the testing.
Absolutely. And we have one last question. You both get 30 seconds, and that's it. It'll be a hard 30 seconds. And this one's from Afsana. Have the panelists observed a change or even a shift in methods of state surveillance against nationwide BLM protests in the US in 2020 in comparison to previous years?
Yes, and one symbolic thing I'll say real fast is that I've seen police actively now trying to shoot for eyes, trying to blind protesters symbolically and literally. There's a great Washington Post report that stitches together citizen journalism of this last couple of weeks and shows 8 people that we know of have lost their eyesight in one eye because police aimed for it. So this looking, this witnessing, this bearing witness while Black, and in many cases the victims were not Black, but the fact that people are daring to put themselves in that space of challenging state-sponsored violence is also putting them at harm in terms of being physically blinded. So yes, I have seen that as a new tactic where it's moving from the virtual in terms of harassment to now a more stronger physical, visceral reaction.
The only thing that I've noticed is in journalism generally, being able to find out how the different ways they triangulate data to try and figure out who is where. And there was a very famous story in the front of the New York Times where they had arrested a protester based on Pinterest boards, Facebook posts, and I think TikTok dance videos. And that's how they got to the person. And I knew that they had Facebook units. I mean, Facebook units are very, very famous, but now I was like, wow, they're taking this cross-platform approach to surveillance, which I find extremely terrifying.
So we're out of time, unfortunately. This has been so, so wonderful. I wish we could do this all the time, except for maybe like slightly less stressful and also not in the pandemic. But thank you both for joining us. Thank you to all y'all who are watching at home and near and far and wherever you are and engaging. And thank you so much to the Museum of the Moving Image for co-hosting with Theorizing the Web. And we hope that you will join us in the future. We are planning to do this on a semi-regular basis with slightly different formats. So we hope that you'll come back and continue to engage and listen and learn. Thank you so much and have a good night.